The moment Lena stepped inside her apartment, she knew something was wrong. It was too quiet, too still. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Her fingers tightened around her keys, her pulse quickening. The lights were off, but the faintest glow from the street lamps outside spilled through the curtains, casting eerie shadows across the floor. She swallowed hard and reached for the light switch. A quiet click. The soft glow of the lamp by the couch illuminated the room. And there he was, sitting in her favorite chair, his legs crossed, his fingers lazily tapping against the armrest. His dark eyes gleamed with something unreadable, something that sent a slow, crawling shiver down her spine. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. She had run. She had changed everything, her name, her city, her entire life. She had been careful, but it hadn't been enough. You thought you could run from me? His voice was smooth, almost amused, but laced with something dark and dangerous. Her fingers went numb. The keys slipped from her grasp, hitting the floor with a metallic clink that echoed too loudly in the suffocating silence. She took a step back, but he was already moving, rising from the chair with a slow, deliberate grace, as if he had all the time in the world. As if he owned this moment. As if he owned her. You were always mine. His words sent a violent shudder through her. Lena turned, her heart hammering, but she barely made it a step before a strong arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her back against an all-too-familiar chest. "Don't," he murmured against her ear, his breath warm, his grip unyielding. "You know how this goes, sweetheart. Running only makes it worse." Her pulse pounded. Panic clawed up her throat, but she bit it back. She couldn't let him see it. Couldn't let him win. "I'm not yours," she ground out, forcing steel into her voice. His grip tightened, just enough to remind her of the power he held, just enough to make her breath hitch. "You are," he murmured, his lips ghosting over her ear. "And you always will be." Lena's breath came in short, sharp gasps as she struggled against his grip. But it was useless. He was stronger, always had been. Every muscle in his body was honed to keep her exactly where he wanted, beneath his control. She forced herself to stay still, to think. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. "You can't do this," she whispered, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. His chest rumbled with a low chuckle. "Can't I?" His fingers brushed against her wrist, his touch deceptively gentle, yet possessive. "You made this difficult, Lena. Changing your name, erasing your past. I almost admired the effort. Almost." She squeezed her eyes shut. He had found her. That meant everything she had done, everything she had sacrificed, had been for nothing. Her stomach clenched. "No. There has to be a way out." She forced herself to meet his gaze. "Let me go," she said, as evenly as she could. "Whatever twisted game this is, it's over." His expression darkened. "Game?" he echoed, amusement vanishing like a candle snuffed out. His grip on her wrist tightened, not enough to hurt, but enough to remind her that he could. That he would. "You think this was a game to me?" he asked softly, tilting his head. His voice was calm, but she wasn't fooled. This was the kind of quiet before a storm, before devastation. Lena swallowed hard. "I spent years looking for you." His fingers trailed up her arm, his touch possessive, branding her with an invisible mark. "Do you know how it felt? To wake up every day, knowing you were out there, running from me?" His lips curled, but it wasn't a smile. "Knowing some other man might have had the pleasure of touching what's mine?" A cold wave of terror washed over her. He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "Tell me, Lena, did anyone touch you?" She jerked away, but he caught her chin between his fingers, forcing her to look at him. His dark eyes burned into hers, demanding an answer. Lena clenched her jaw. "I'd rather die than belong to you again." Silence. For a moment, the tension was so thick she swore she could hear her own heartbeat hammering in her ears. Then crack. His hand slammed against the wall beside her, caging her in. Her body went rigid. "You always say the most interesting things." His voice was almost affectionate, but the undercurrent of menace was unmistakable. But I know you, sweetheart. And we both know you don't want to die. Her nails dug into her palms. That doesn't mean I want you. He smirked. That's the thing about you, Lena. You lie so easily. Even to yourself. Her breathing turned shallow.
Stay calm.
Stay in control. But how could she, when he was standing so close, when his presence was overwhelming, suffocating? She needed to escape.
Now.
She flicked her gaze toward the door, calculating her chances. If she could just— I wouldn't, he murmured, following her gaze. His fingers traced along her jaw, tilting her face back toward him. You run, I catch you. We've done that before, remember? Her stomach twisted. Of course, he remembered. I won't let you take me again, she gritted out. His lips curled into something dark, something victorious. Oh, sweetheart, he whispered, his grip tightening ever so slightly. I already have. Then, before she could react, he pulled a syringe from his pocket. Her eyes widened. No. Too late. A sharp prick. A burning sensation. The room tilted. Her legs buckled. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was his face, watching her with quiet satisfaction. You were always mine, Lena. And then nothing. A dull, throbbing ache pulsed at the back of Lena's head as she slowly drifted back to consciousness. Her body felt heavy, her limbs sluggish, like she was floating in thick water. No, not floating. Lying down. Her lashes fluttered, but the moment she tried to move, a sharp tug at her wrist stopped her. Panic snapped her fully awake. Her heart pounded as she blinked against the dim lighting, her vision swimming before sharpening into clarity. She was in a bedroom, one she didn't recognize. The walls were a muted gray, the furniture sleek and expensive. The bed she was lying on was soft, almost too comfortable. But none of that mattered, because her wrists were bound. Thick leather cuffs encircled them, secured to the headboard with silver buckles. She tried jerking her arms free, but they barely budged. A low whimper of frustration escaped her lips as she kicked out her legs, only to realize her ankles were restrained too. She was trapped. The door creaked open. Lena froze, her breath shallow as he stepped inside. The man who had haunted her nightmares. The man she had spent years running from. And yet here he was, leaning against the doorframe, hands tucked casually into his pockets, watching her with a look of quiet satisfaction. Awake already? His voice was smooth, almost gentle, as if he were greeting a lover instead of a prisoner. Her throat felt raw when she spoke. Let me go. His lips twitched, but he said nothing. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze drinking her in like a man who had been starving for too long. Do you have any idea how long I waited for this? His fingers traced the edge of the bed, slow, deliberate. How many nights I lay awake, wondering where you were.
Who you were with.
Lena clenched her jaw, refusing to show fear. I don't belong to you. He sighed, shaking his head. You keep saying that. With unhurried precision, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and metallic. It glinted under the dim light. A collar. Lena's stomach plummeted. Don't, she breathed, struggling against the restraints. But he simply sat on the edge of the bed, watching her panic with something close to amusement. You always fight, he murmured. It's one of the things I love about you. Her skin crawled as he brushed her hair back, his fingers gentle. Too gentle. Get away from me, she spat. He exhaled softly, as if disappointed. Then, before she could react, he reached forward and clasped the collar around her throat. A soft click. Final. Unbreakable. Lena gasped, her body trembling with fury and helplessness. You bastard. He only smiled. Mine. His fingers grazed the metal, almost reverent. Now, let's try this again, sweetheart. Are you going to behave? Or do I need to teach you what happens when you disobey? Lena's breath came in ragged bursts. Every instinct screamed at her to fight, to resist. But as she stared into his dark, unreadable gaze, one terrifying truth settled into her bones. She wasn't escaping this time. Not yet. Not until she found a way to destroy him first. Lena's breaths came fast and shallow as the cold metal of the collar pressed against her skin. It wasn't just the physical weight of it, it was the meaning behind it. Possession. Control. She had spent years running, clawing her way toward freedom, and now, in the span of a single night, he had taken it all away. Again. Her wrists ached from pulling at the restraints, but she forced herself to meet his gaze, refusing to let him see her break.
Not yet.
You really think this will make me yours? She whispered, her voice laced with quiet fury. He tilted his head, studying her with that infuriating patience. No, sweetheart. His fingers traced the collar, lingering just beneath her jaw. You were already mine. This just makes sure you don't forget it again. Lena clenched her teeth. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but she forced herself to stay calm. Losing control wouldn't help her. It would only feed into his twisted sense of power. She inhaled deeply. And what now? She asked, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Are you going to keep me locked up like some pet? Keep me on a leash? A slow smirk curled his lips. Would that bother you? She glared at him. Go to hell. He chuckled, as if her defiance amused him. You always say the most tempting things, sweetheart. He leaned in, his face mere inches from hers, and she forced herself to hold still. She wouldn't flinch. She wouldn't. You're not leaving this time, Lena, he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. No more running. No more hiding. We're going to fix what you broke. Her stomach twisted. Fix? As if what they had was something that could be repaired. She swallowed down the bitterness rising in her throat. You think tying me to a bed and locking me up is going to change how I feel about you? He let out a soft hum. Maybe. Maybe not. His fingers trailed down the length of her arm, tracing invisible patterns on her skin. But you'll learn, eventually. Lena clenched her fists. You're insane. He laughed, dark and low. I prefer the term devoted. Something inside her snapped. Then let me show you just how much I hate your devotion, she snarled, twisting her body violently. Using every ounce of strength, she slammed her knee upward, aiming for his ribs. But he was faster. Before she could land the hit, he grabbed her thigh, pushing it down with ease. His grip tightened, possessive, unyielding. His eyes darkened, amusement fading into something more dangerous. Still so wild, he murmured, his voice low, almost admiring. That's what I love about you, Lena. You fight like hell. She spat at him. His reaction was instant. His fingers wrapped around her throat, not enough to cut off her air, but enough to make her still. Enough to remind her who had the power here. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them crackled with something volatile, something dangerous. Then he leaned in, his lips just a breath away from hers. You'll break, sweetheart, he whispered, his grip tightening just slightly. But don't worry, I'll put you back together again. Lena's heart pounded, but she forced herself to meet his gaze with fire in her eyes. If you think I'll ever stop fighting, you don't know me at all. He smirked, his thumb stroking over her pulse. Oh, but I do. Then, just as suddenly as he had touched her, he pulled away, releasing her throat. Lena gasped, her body shuddering at the loss of contact, not from longing, but from the sharp reminder of how easily he could control her. He stood, adjusting his sleeves as if nothing had happened. Get some rest, he murmured. You'll need your strength.
For what? She snapped.
He smirked. For tomorrow. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out, the lock clicking shut behind him. Lena lay still, her pulse pounding in her ears. Tomorrow. Whatever he had planned, she knew one thing for certain. She had to find a way to escape. And this time, she wouldn't fail. Lena lay motionless, staring at the ceiling as her heart pounded against her ribs. Tomorrow. The word echoed in her mind like a promise of something far worse than tonight. He had always been a man of control, of obsession, and now he had her exactly where he wanted. But not forever. She tugged at the restraints again, testing their strength. The leather dug into her skin, unyielding, and the collar sat heavy around her throat like a cruel reminder of her captivity. She forced herself to breathe. Panicking won't help. Think, Lena.
Think.
She flexed her fingers, searching for anything within reach, but the bed was devoid of anything useful. He hadn't been careless. He had planned for this. Her stomach twisted. A creak at the door sent a fresh wave of tension through her body. She turned her head sharply as the knob twisted. Light from the hallway poured into the dim room, casting his tall frame into silhouette. He stepped inside, his movements slow, deliberate, like a predator toying with his prey. Can't sleep? His voice was soft, laced with amusement. Lena glared at him. Go to hell. He chuckled, moving closer. You really should get some rest, sweetheart. You'll need it. She clenched her jaw. For what? He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the small table beside the bed, picking up a glass of water. He held it up to her lips. Drink. She stared at him, unmoving. I'm not stupid. He smirked.
No, you're not.
But I wouldn't waste a second dose on you. He tilted the glass slightly. You need to stay hydrated. Lena hesitated. Every fiber of her being screamed not to trust him, but her throat was dry, her body weak. If she passed out from exhaustion or dehydration, she wouldn't stand a chance when an opportunity to escape came. Reluctantly, she parted her lips. The water was cool, soothing against her parched throat. But the moment she swallowed, he traced his fingers along her jaw, tilting her chin up. Good girl, he murmured. Lena yanked her face away, her pulse roaring in her ears. Don't call me that. He only smiled. You'll get used to it. Her blood turned to ice. He set the glass down and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small silver key. Her heart leapt. Was he? But instead of unbuckling her restraints, he reached for the collar around her neck. The lock clicked open, and for the first time since she woke up, Lena felt a rush of air against her throat. Relief was fleeting, because his fingers brushed against her skin, tracing the faint red marks left behind. His gaze darkened. You look beautiful like this, he murmured. Lena jerked away, but she couldn't go far. Screw you. He exhaled, shaking his head as if disappointed. Still so defiant. His fingers trailed lower, stopping just above her pulse. I wonder how long you'll last. Her chest tightened. What the hell does that mean? He leaned in, his lips just a breath away from her ear. Tomorrow we begin. A cold chill slithered down her spine. Begin what? She demanded. He pulled back, studying her as if debating how much to tell her. Then, with a small smirk, he stood up. You'll see. Lena yanked at her restraints again, rage surging through her veins. I will kill you for this. He only laughed. I look forward to seeing you try. Then, he turned and walked out, the lock clicking shut behind him once more. Lena's breath came in ragged bursts as she stared at the door. Whatever tomorrow held, she had to be ready, because she would rather die than let him win. Lena barely slept. Every second that passed felt like a countdown to something unknown, something dangerous. Her mind raced with ways to escape. The restraints were too strong. The collar was off, but that meant little when she was still bound to the bed. And he, that monster, was always one step ahead. The hours crawled by, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. Then, just as the first hints of morning light filtered through the window, the door creaked open. He stepped inside. Dressed in all black, his presence seemed to command the room, suffocating and unshakable. His gaze settled on her, unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something darkly satisfied. He enjoys this. Lena swallowed down the nausea curling in her gut. Good morning, sweetheart. She didn't reply. His smirk widened. Still silent? You must really be curious about what I have planned. She was curious, but she'd rather bite off her tongue than give him the satisfaction of asking. He walked closer, pulling something from his pocket. A small, black remote. Lena's stomach twisted. What is that? He pressed a button. A sharp click echoed in the air, her ankle restraints unlocking. Then her wrists. Lena bolted upright instantly, her muscles screaming from being bound for so long. She barely had a second to react before he tossed something onto the bed beside her.
Clothes.
Put them on, he ordered. She eyed them warily.
Why?
He tilted his head, amused. Because I said so. Her hands clenched into fists.
Control.
That's what this was. A game of power. Turn around, she snapped. He chuckled.
No.
Her teeth ground together, but she had no choice. He had all the leverage. Slowly, she reached for the clothes, feeling the fabric between her fingers. Simple, casual, black leggings and a long-sleeve shirt. Nothing unusual. Her mind spun with possibilities. Was this her chance? Was he actually letting her move freely? Carefully, she slipped out of the dress she had been in, every movement slow, controlled. His eyes never left her. She could feel his gaze, burning into her like a brand. When she was dressed, she turned to face him, her expression cold. Now what? He smiled. Now we go outside. Lena's breath caught. Outside? She forced herself to stay calm. And if I refuse? His smirk didn't falter. Then I carry you. A chill ran through her. She had no choice. Lena exhaled sharply and stepped toward him, careful not to reveal the racing of her heart. He extended a hand. She ignored it. His smirk widened, but he said nothing as he led her toward the door. The moment they stepped into the hallway, Lena took in everything. The layout, the exits, the locked doors, the windows too high to climb through. She needed to learn everything. They walked in silence until they reached another door, one that led outside. Fresh air hit her like a shock, and for a moment, she just breathed. The property was secluded. A vast, open space surrounded by thick woods. No neighbors. No witnesses. No easy way out. He watched her reaction, a knowing look in his eyes. Beautiful, isn't it? Lena turned to him, her voice flat. You expect me to thank you? He chuckled.
No.
I expect you to behave. Her fists clenched. He motioned toward a black SUV parked nearby. Get in. Every muscle in her body screamed in warning. This was it. She had two choices. Comply and wait for another opportunity, or run and risk everything now. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she weighed her chances. Then, without warning,
she ran.
Straight toward the woods. Her feet pounded against the earth, her breath sharp as adrenaline surged through her. She didn't look back. Didn't stop. Didn't. A strong arm wrapped around her waist, yanking her back with brutal force. Lena screamed, thrashing violently, but he was too strong. He spun her around, his grip like iron as he slammed her against his chest. His breath was steady, controlled, as if he had expected this all along. Tisk, TSK, sweetheart. His voice was smooth, patient, but there was something dark underneath. That was a very bad idea. Lena spat in his face. His grip tightened. Then, without warning, he threw her over his shoulder, like she weighed nothing. She fought.
Kicked.
Screamed. But it was useless. You're really testing my patience, he murmured as he carried her back toward the SUV. Lena clawed at his back. Let me go, you psychopath. He sighed, as if her struggling exhausted him. You never learn. Then, just as they reached the car, he pressed another button on that damned remote. A sharp, electrical shock shot through her body. Lena gasped, her muscles seizing as pain burned through her nerves. Her vision blurred. Her strength drained in an instant. The last thing she saw was his cold, satisfied smirk before everything faded into darkness. A sharp pain pulsed at the base of Lena's skull as consciousness dragged her back into reality. Her body felt heavy, sluggish, the aftereffects of whatever he had done to her. She tried to move, but her limbs barely responded. The shock had left her drained, weak. Damn him. She blinked, her vision slowly sharpening. The interior of the SUV came into focus, dark leather seats, tinted windows. The faint hum of the engine filled the silence, steady and controlled, just like the man driving. He sat in the front seat, one hand on the wheel, the other resting lazily on the armrest. He wasn't watching her, but she knew he was aware of her every movement. Awake already? His voice was smooth, unfazed. Lena's jaw clenched. She refused to speak, refusing to give him even the smallest satisfaction. He chuckled. Still so stubborn. She turned her head, staring out the window. Dense forest blurred past them, the road winding through endless trees. No signs. No landmarks. No way to tell where they were going. "Where are you taking me?" she demanded, her throat dry. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted his grip on the wheel, his fingers tapping lightly against the leather. "You'll see soon enough." Lena's stomach twisted. She wasn't stupid. This wasn't just about control. He was moving her somewhere else. Somewhere even more secure. Somewhere I can't escape.
She had to act now.
She shifted slightly, testing her movements. Her body was still sluggish, but she could feel strength returning little by little. Her eyes flickered to the door handle.
Locked.
But maybe. Slowly, she adjusted her position, inching toward the edge of her seat. "Don't." His voice was calm, but laced with warning. Lena froze. She hadn't even made it halfway before he had noticed. Her pulse pounded. "Let me go." He sighed, as if exhausted by the very idea. "I told you, Lena. You belong to me." She gritted her teeth. "I don't belong to anyone." His fingers tightened around the steering wheel. "You will." The finality in his voice sent a chill through her. Lena's mind spun. Think, damn it. The SUV was moving fast, but if she could get the door open, even for a second, she sucked in a breath and lunged. Her fingers barely brushed the handle before a sharp grip closed around her wrist. In the blink of an eye, he wrenched her arm back, twisting her body toward him with brutal force. Lena gasped, her back hitting the seat as he yanked her close, his face inches from hers. "Enough," he growled. His usual calm was gone. His eyes burned with something darker, something raw. Lena's heart pounded, but she refused to look away. "Kill me if you want," she spat. "I'd rather die than be yours." For a second, just a second, something flickered in his gaze. Then his grip tightened. "You don't get to die, sweetheart," he murmured, his voice dangerously soft. "You get to learn." Her stomach twisted. He let go just as suddenly as he had grabbed her, shoving her back against the seat. Lena sucked in air, her wrist throbbing, but she refused to show weakness. The car ride continued in silence. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. Then finally the SUV slowed. Lena's breath caught as she saw where they were. A massive estate loomed ahead, isolated, surrounded by high walls and electronic gates.
No.
Her fingers curled into fists. He had planned this. Every step, every move. He had won. The SUV rolled to a stop. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Welcome home, Lena." The doors unlocked with a quiet click. And she knew the real nightmare was just beginning. The door to the SUV clicked open, but Lena didn't move. Her pulse pounded as she stared at the massive estate looming ahead. It was surrounded by thick, high walls, topped with security cameras that watched every inch of the property. The driveway stretched in a perfect curve toward an entrance lined with stone columns, the kind that belonged to a place built to last forever. Just like he planned for her. A hand wrapped around her wrist, firm, unyielding. "Out," he ordered. Lena jerked back, but his grip was ironclad. She glared at him. "What if I don't?" His lips curled into something almost amused. "Then I'll carry you again." Lena's stomach twisted at the memory of being slung over his shoulder like she was nothing. She yanked her hand free, her breathing sharp, and slid out of the car on her own. Cold air wrapped around her, but it wasn't enough to calm the fury burning in her veins. He stepped out after her, moving with that same effortless grace, like a predator that knew it had already won. Lena forced herself to stay still as he walked past her, heading toward the entrance. The second his back was turned, she pivoted.
And ran.
Her feet barely hit the pavement before a sharp click echoed behind her.
Pain.
A sudden jolt of electricity shot through her body, sending her crashing to the ground with a choked gasp. Lena's vision blurred. Her muscles seized. And then he was there, towering over her, watching, waiting. You really don't learn, do you? His voice was calm, but there was something dark underneath. Lena's fingers curled into the pavement, her body still trembling from the shock.
She wanted to fight.
Wanted to scream, but she was too weak. He crouched down, his fingers tilting her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. You are mine, Lena. The sooner you understand that, the easier this will be. She glared at him, breathless and shaking. Go to hell. He smirked. Darling, you are my hell. Then, without another word, he scooped her into his arms and carried her inside. Lena thrashed weakly, but he didn't falter. He carried her through grand hallways, past rooms that whispered of wealth and power. Then he stopped. A door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit bedroom. Large, beautiful,
Caged.
He stepped inside and lowered her onto the bed. Lena gasped, struggling to sit up, but his hand pressed gently against her collarbone, keeping her in place. Rest, he murmured. She stared at him, her body still aching. I'll never stop fighting you. His fingers brushed against her cheek. I know, he whispered, almost fondly. Then he stood and walked toward the door. Lena forced herself to sit up, her breathing ragged. You think you own me? He paused. Then, slowly, he turned his head, his gaze locking onto hers with a dangerous gleam. I do own you, sweetheart. The door clicked shut. And Lena knew this wasn't just a trap. It was a game. And she had no idea how to win. Lena sat in the dimly lit room, her body aching from the earlier shock. Every breath felt heavy, like she was inhaling the weight of her own captivity. But she wasn't broken. Not yet. She scanned the room, taking in every detail, the grand bed, the locked windows, the thick door that separated her from the world outside. Everything about this place screamed control. But control could be broken. She had one chance, and she would not waste it. The next day, he returned. She didn't fight when he entered, didn't resist when he approached. She simply sat on the edge of the bed, her expression blank, her hands resting lightly in her lap. His sharp gaze flickered with something unreadable. Suspicion? Amusement? Have you finally come to your senses? He asked, tilting his head. Lena lifted her eyes to his, letting her lips curve into a small, delicate smile. Maybe. He chuckled. That easy, huh? She said nothing, only let her fingers brush against his wrist as he sat beside her. A subtle touch.
Soft.
Willing. His gaze darkened. You're playing a dangerous game, sweetheart, he murmured. Lena leaned in just slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. So are you. She felt his breath hitch for just a second, just enough. Then, with all the strength she had left, she struck. A blade, small, stolen, hidden beneath her sleeve, sliced across his side in one clean motion. He jerked back, eyes wide, but she was already moving. Lena bolted, pushing past him and racing for the door. Her heart pounded, her pulse roaring in her ears. The hallway stretched before her, open, endless. Freedom. But then, a sharp grip caught her wrist. Her body slammed into the wall. Pain exploded through her, but she didn't stop fighting, clawing, kicking. Blood stained his shirt, but he barely seemed to notice. His grip tightened, his breath harsh, furious. You really don't know when to quit, do you? He growled. Lena spat in his face. I'd rather die than be yours. His jaw clenched, his body trembling with something dark, something almost shattered. Then, suddenly, he let go. Lena staggered back, her breath sharp, her mind spinning. He stood there, his hands curled into fists, his expression unreadable. You win, Lena. She froze. His voice was quiet, almost empty.
Go, he said. Run.
Be free. She didn't move. He turned away, stepping back, giving her space. But she saw it. The exhaustion in his stance. The truth in his eyes. This was never about control. Not really. It was about never losing her again. Lena's heart twisted, but she forced herself to move. Forced herself to run. The estate gates loomed ahead. She didn't look back. Not when she reached the trees. Not when the estate disappeared behind her. Not even when she finally tasted freedom. But she would never forget the way he had looked at her. Like she had been his salvation. And his destruction.